Good morning and welcome everyone to the 7th meeting of the Local Government and Communities Committee this year. Please ensure all mobile phones are on silent. A reminder that broadcasting will operate your camera and microphone as usual, and please allow a short pause before being called on to speak to allow them to do so. We've received apologies today from Annie Wells and Jeremy Balfour as her substitute. Agenda item 1, we have consideration of whether to take agenda items 6 and 7 in private. Agenda item 6 is consideration of the evidence heard on budget and local government settlement 21-22. Item 7 is consideration of the evidence heard on climate change update plan. As we're meeting remotely, rather than asking whether everyone agrees, I will, as normal, instead ask if anyone objects. If there is silence, I will assume content. Does anyone object? Okay, in that case, thank you very much. That is agreed. Items 6 and 7 will be taken in private. Agenda item 2, the committee will take evidence on the draft Local Authority Capital Finance and Accounting Scotland Coronavirus Amendment Regulations 2021. And I now welcome Kate Forbes, Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Hazel Black, Head of Local Authority Accounting, and Colin Brown, Senior Principal Legal Officer, Scottish Government. This instrument is laid under the affirmative procedure, which means that Parliament must approve it before the provisions can come into force. Following this evidence session, the committee will be invited at the next agenda items to consider the motion to approve the instrument. I remind everyone that the Scottish Government officials can speak under this item, but not in the debate that follows. I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement.
Good morning, Convener, and thank you for having me. As we are all agreed, I'm sure, local authorities have played a crucial role in supporting local communities through the pandemic, and providing that support has meant that they have incurred additional costs, which, coupled with lost income from closures, means that councils are under significant financial pressure. I'm sure we'll go into greater detail on that in the next part of the agenda. During the course of the last year, I have constantly pressed the UK Government for additional funding to address both our own budget pressures and those of local government. Now, the UK Government was relatively slow to respond, making it uncertain whether that additional funding would be sufficient to allow local government to meet additional funding pressures without cutting vital services or raising council tax. So in the absence of that certainty and that clarity, the Scottish Government worked very closely with COSLA to identify other ways for local government to address the funding pressures. And the amendment being sought in this regulation is to allow a local authority to reduce the amount of any of the statutory repayments it is due to make to the Statutory Loans Fund in either the financial year 2020-21 or 2021-22, but not both. Reducing the amount of any of the statutory repayments due to be repaid in either last financial year or next financial year will reduce the expenditure of a local authority in that financial year, thus creating additional financial capacity to meet COVID-19 costs. Under normal circumstances, this is not something that ministers would support. Requiring the repayments to be made in the financial year that they're due is, of course, prudent financial management. It ensures that both current and future taxpayers are charged for their share of the capital expenditure costs of assets being used to deliver services. But obviously, these are not normal circumstances, and it seems right to allow that flexibility. However, I've made it clear to local government that this flexibility should only be used as necessary to address funding pressures arising from the pandemic. The regulations also include a provision to replace the existing repayment provisions with a new provision, which is repayments in accordance with proper accounting practices. That change is to allow future harmonisation between accounting standards and statutory arrangements. Separately, and just as I come to a close, the regulations also change the audit completion deadline for local government 2020-21 annual accounts, as requested by Audit Scotland, to address knock-on effects from a delay in auditing 2019-2020 accounts. So in summary, Convener, I've gone on longer than I normally would, but I think it's quite a complex instrument. In summary, the regulations provide a financial flexibility that has been asked for by local authorities, and I hope will be welcomed by local authorities. But of course, I'm happy to answer any questions that the committee might have.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. We now move on to questions from members. If you have a question, please notify this via the digital channels available to you. Just type R for request I'll call anyone who wants to ask a question in turn by name, and please allow a second for your microphone to be operated. Cabinet Secretary, please state clearly if an official is being brought in to answer any questions. Andy Whiteman.
Thanks very much, Convener. Thanks to the Cabinet Secretary for her remarks. This is a complicated instrument and some complicated policy areas to be covered in it. I just wonder if you could clarify that the provisions in this instrument are in essentially one-off adjustments, and there's no plan to continue any of these adjustments into future financial years.
That's right, but I will ask Hazel Black to come in as the fount of all technical knowledge. But yes, that is my reading of it. Hazel, do you want to come in?
Yes, that is correct. This is just a temporary arrangement, and it's only for the one financial year that the local authority can make that adjustment, and it's not a plan to do that again.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks, Convener. It was just to clarify, when would the funds that haven't been paid in any one additional year have to be paid by? Is there a time frame that the repayments would need to be made by?
Again, Hazel, do you want to come in, just because it's quite technical?
Yes, so the regulations set out themselves that a local authority has to make that repayment within the next 20 years as a maximum, but in most cases each individual loan can only be spread over the remaining life of each of the individual loans fund advances, and where that loans fund advance exceeds 20 years, it's limited to 20 years. So it has to be repaid within those timelines.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Sarah?
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, it was just a very quick question to ask about flexibility going forward and forward planning. We'll maybe come on to it later, but one of the drivers, I'm guessing, behind this is loss of income. Have you done any work with COSLA on what the reasonable estimates are for the upcoming financial year, given the circumstances we're still in? Thank you.
We have started that conversation. So as you will know, presumably because you took evidence from COSLA, we spent a considerable amount of last year trying to get returns from every local authority to understand the impact of loss of income last year. And we have that in terms of the first few quarters. Looking forward, I think it's fair to say, and we will ask for that information from local government again, but it's fair to say it's very difficult to quantify right now in terms of the loss of income. So for example, if we move out of lockdown more slowly, that will have an impact on ALIOs, it will have an impact on community halls, it will have an impact on how busy town centres are in terms of parking charges. So it's very difficult for local government right now to forecast loss of income for the upcoming year. But we have a relatively good handle on loss of income in last year. And as you will have seen from my announcement yesterday, we have allocated in 3 instalments additional funding for loss of income last year. And where local government is unable to use that money, as it were, last year, they can then carry that forward in reserves. But that funding is specifically for loss of income last year.
Sarah?
No, it's clearly future financial pressures are building up now. Thanks, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Keith?
Thanks, Convener. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary that these measures, I think, will be extremely welcome for local government, just knowing local government, especially actually the issue on accounts, which they can get very concerned about submitting on time. I just wonder, given what you just said in response to Sarah Boyack's answer, does you have a feel for how many local authorities are likely to take up these opportunities? Is it uneven or is it right across the board?
Well, this instrument is part of a number of different flexibilities, and the reason we designed it that way is so that each local authority could make use of flexibilities as and when they needed it, and the same applies to the loss of income funding. So, for example, we know that about 4 local authorities don't actually have ALIOs. So in terms of the way that they are experiencing loss of income, it's very different. And I deeply apologise, my home landline never goes off and it's just started ringing. So I don't know if you can hear that or not. But in terms of these flexibilities, it's for local authorities. We estimate that this particular flexibility could be valued at £541 million, because that was the repayments made in 2018-19. So the estimated value of this flexibility is likely to be of a similar value, but there are other flexibilities that local authorities might want to make use of, as well as the loss of income. So it's very much designed as a package, a toolbox, as it were, for local authorities to then use any or all of the tools as they see fit to deal with their own challenges.
Okay.
That's all, Convener. Thanks.
Okay. Right, thank you. Alexander?
Thank you, Convener. Yes, Cabinet Secretary, I think you've indicated that the flexibility is very welcome, and councils will, along with COSLA, be very secure that this has and going to take place, because it will give them the opportunity. But you've talked about the package today and the possibilities from that package and a toolkit. So what is your estimation of the facilities that will be required by certain councils? Do you have a scale that you would expect to see certain councils requesting or involving in this whole process in comparison? You've already indicated today that some don't have ALIOs, so they won't be in such a dire need as others, but others will be in a very different and precarious position.
That's right. So I should put on record, I don't see flexibilities as a substitute for cash. But if you recall my opening remarks, we worked with COSLA to design these flexibilities, and we had to work with the UK government as well in receiving support for proceeding with these flexibilities. These flexibilities were designed at a point where we were told by the UK government that, I think at the point it was about £4 billion, that was due to last us for the full year. So there wasn't any additional funding available for anything. Never mind local government. So the flexibilities were there to try and relieve some of the pressure, and they were very much proposed by COSLA, and then we took those proposals, worked with them and worked with UK government officials to see what we could progress with. And not all of the flexibilities that we took to the UK government were agreed to. So this is a package designed to offer support. Now, since then, we've been able to go much further on things like loss of income. So we still don't, at this point in time, have any confirmation from the UK government about what the consequential funding will be from loss of income. We have not been, that figure has not been confirmed. So it's off our own fact that we have said that of the initial 90 million, we will increase it to 200 million. And then yesterday, I added a £275 million on top of that. So that's us doing it off our own bat with the funding that we have. And my hope is that each local authority will be facing different challenges. So some local authorities have more ALIOs than others. Some are more dependent on income than others. Some, for example, when we granted the flexibility over early learning and childcare to be able to use that funding for other things last year, some were more advanced with early learning and childcare than others. So that was more of a resource for some local authorities than others. It's not for me to dictate to local authorities what use they make of these flexibilities, but the broader the package, the more I hope that there will be something there for everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll now move on then, unless anybody's got any further questions, we'll now move on to agenda item 3, which is formal consideration of motion S5M 24096, calling for this committee to recommend approval of the draft local authority capital finance and accounting Scotland Coronavirus Amendment Regulations 2021. That we've just taken evidence on. I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move the motion and speak to it if she has anything further to add.
I don't have anything further to say, Convener, and I move the motion in my name.
Okay, thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I now invite contributions from members. If If there are none, I will then move on to the motion. The question is that motion S5M 24096 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary for Finance be approved. Are we all agreed? Agreed. Thank you very much. The motion has therefore been agreed. The committee will report on this instrument in due course, and I invite the committee to delegate authority to me as convener to approve a draft of the report for publication. I thank the Cabinet Secretary and our officials for taking part in this meeting, and I will now suspend briefly to allow a witness changeover. 2 minutes suspension. The committee is taking evidence from the Scottish Government on the financial settlement for local government, the third sector and housing, as set out in the Scottish Government's Budget 2021-22. And today I welcome Aileen Campbell, Cabinet Secretary for Communities and Local Government, Kate Forbes, Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Caroline Dix, Investment Manager, More Homes Division, Shirley Lane, Director for Housing and Social Justice, Graham Owenson, Team Leader, LGE Finance, Local Taxation Policy and Business Rates, and Ian Storey, Head of Non-Domestic Rates Policy, Scottish Government. And thank you all for being here today. And just for information, we have allocated around 70 minutes for this session. Some brief technical information. There's a pre-arranged questioning order, and I will call each member in turn to ask their questions for up to 9 minutes. It would help broadcasting if members could indicate who in the panel their questions are addressed to. We may have some time for supplementary questions at the end. Obviously, there's a lot on the panel today, so I would ask that members ask short, succinct questions, and as possible, the Cabinet Secretaries ask for answer in the same vein. Thank you. And I now invite the Cabinet Secretary for Communities and Local Government to make a short opening statement. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary.
Okay, thank you, Convener, for inviting me to the committee today, and I'm pleased to be here alongside my colleague, Cabinet Finance, and supported by my officials, Shirley Lane and Caroline Dix. There can be no doubt that this has been a challenging year. Our spending plans have been and will continue to be crucial in ensuring that we're able to support people and communities in the face of the social and economic challenges presented by COVID-19. The work of the Social Renewal Advisory Board and its Call to Action report points towards the actions and changes required to help a fairer Scotland emerge from the pandemic. With this budget, I'm investing in actions designed to tackle deep-seated poverty and inequality, to support our communities and third sector to ensure that fairer Scotland. We're almost doubling our funding to tackle child poverty to over £23 million, delivering on our commitment to spend £50 million over the 4 years of the Tackling Child Poverty Delivery Plan. This is in addition to the resources announced in the Social Security portfolio for the first full year of the Scottish Child Payment. We continue to alleviate the impact of the UK Government welfare cuts, and my portfolio will be making £83.1 million available in 2021-22 for discretionary housing payments. We remain committed to mitigating the bedroom tax in full, and this budget will enable us to do that. As announced by the Finance Secretary yesterday, we will invest an additional £100 million in 21-22 to help low-income households in the year ahead. More details of this investment will follow in due course when we've discussed with COSLA and local authorities. I know that this committee has raised views on the support for adaptations, and despite a challenging budgetary environment, I'm pleased that we've again protected the funding available to assist registered social landlords in delivering adaptations for older and disabled tenants, and have increased this budget from £10 million to £11 million for 21-22. Everyone should be entitled to a safe, warm home, and that has never been more important than over the past year. Thanks to targeted funding and collective action by national and local government and the third sector, the number of people rough sleeping in Scotland has reduced dramatically during the pandemic. And this has strengthened our resolve to end homelessness for good. As we enter year 4 of a 5-year £50 million spending programme, 21-22 budget of over £12 million will enable us to build on the tremendous progress and deliver on the actions in our updated Ending Homeless Together action plan. With this budget, we are also now making available £190 million for fuel poverty and energy efficiency measures, contributing to a just transition and to our net zero ambitions. In addition, we remain absolutely committed to delivering more social and affordable housing. High quality, affordable homes in good neighbourhoods leads to reduced poverty and inequality, better health outcomes, and improved educational attainment. And that is why we have now allocated a further £120 million for affordable homes in 21-22, which brings the Affordable Housing Supply Programme for next year to £832 million. 5-year housing budget is now over £3.5 billion. This includes over £3.44 billion for affordable homes, meeting the £3.4 billion funding called for by the housing sector to allow social landlords to deliver homes to the required building and energy efficiency standards while keeping rents affordable. And it's not just about the homes we live in. We want to see a fairer Scotland where there are vibrant communities. Regeneration funding is increasing by £84.1 million, with £131.6 million for projects to support community-led regeneration, town centres and 20-minute neighbourhoods where people can meet their needs within a 20-minute walk from their home. Our third sector has also stepped up to play a crucial role in our response to the pandemic. And our budget recognises that with more than £26 million of investment in the local and national third sector infrastructure to support the capacity and growth of social enterprises and ensure the third sector can help people and communities recover from the impact of the pandemic. So, Convener, I hope that gives you a summary of some of the main priorities for my portfolio, and I thank the committee for its pre-budget scrutiny, which has covered a range of issues, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And I now invite the Cabinet Secretary for Finance to make a brief opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener, again for letting me speak this morning, and it's good to be joined by Aileen Campbell to discuss these matters. I've already said it in my opening remarks this morning, but I want to say it again, that I have so enormously appreciated the efforts and the work of our local authorities right across Scotland. Their continued support during these times have been absolutely essential in getting support to businesses, getting support to individuals and families, and they have been a close partner in our decision making. I meet regularly with Gail McGregor to discuss these matters. In coming to our decision to announce the Scottish Budget on the 28th January, before the outcome of the UK budget was known, we listened very carefully to the representations that COSLA made on behalf of local government about the damaging impact of any further delay that could have on the delivery of public services, and also the practical challenges it poses around setting budgets and collecting council tax. It was similar last year, but this year in particular has additional layers of uncertainty. And of course, the delay to the UK budget means that we don't know the total budget available to Scotland. That's precisely why I had to give an update to the budget just a matter of weeks after publishing the budget bill, because additional funding was made available. So we've had to make assumptions about consequentials, we've had to use provisional economic forecasts, and we've had to take decisions on devolved tax policy without knowing the future UK tax policies. It's not of our choosing, but it creates unnecessary challenges for ourselves, but perhaps even more so for local government. Despite that, I think in this budget, we build on the objectives that we share with local government partners about how we build a fairer, stronger and greener economy, how we continue to respond to COVID, and how we emerge from the pandemic. For next year, we've delivered a funding package for local government of £11.6 billion. We've provided an additional £335.6 million for vital day-to-day services. That's an increase of 3.1%. And it builds on the pre-COVID local government finance settlement, which provided an increase in local government day-to-day spending of £589.4 million, or 5.8% compared with the previous year. The settlement also allows councils to join us in financially supporting households who will undoubtedly be struggling as a result of the pandemic, with additional funding to councils that choose to freeze council tax, protecting families who are struggling. That additional funding is equivalent to £90 million for councils, or a 3% rise with inflation at 0.5%, which should more than fully compensate local authorities that choose to freeze council tax. Including the additional £275 million I announced yesterday and the £200 million for the Lost Income Scheme, Scotland's councils will receive £931.1 million in direct COVID support during 2020-21 through the local government finance settlement, with a further £259 million confirmed for next year. That funding is not ring-fenced, but it is also non-recurring, which is an important point when it comes to looking at how it can be used. So taken together with the additional fiscal flexibilities that we just discussed in the previous agenda item, the total value of the COVID-19 support package for councils is £1.8 billion over this year and next. Just as I come to a close, in addition to these extra resources for councils, we have also continued to provide them with funding certainty through the non-domestic rates policies, so including the enhanced retail, hospitality and leisure relief that I confirmed yesterday. The budget delivers an unprecedented reduction in the poundage and £1 billion worth of relief. Those decisions will continue to protect businesses during COVID-19, and unlike in England, we guarantee all the non-domestic rates income for councils, and next year in particular, we'll see the value of that guarantee. So, Convener, I'll come to a close there because I know there will be questions, and we'll continue to support the work of local government, work collaboratively with them. I don't diminish the financial challenges that we all face right now, but we will do all that we can either through flexibilities or funding to try and support the work that councils do right on the front line of responding to COVID.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And we now move on to questions from members. Can I ask, once again, that both Cabinet Secretaries state clearly if an official is being brought in to answer any question? And could everyone give broadcasting staff a second to operate your microphones before you speak? I'll begin with the first question. And given we had evidence from COSLA, but given the announcements that were made yesterday, are you satisfied that these announcements would deal with some of the issues that COSLA raised? For example, they were talking about £205 million to award their workers a 1% pay rise next year. And they talked about unprotected budgets, for example, those of leisure and culture. Do you think that the announcements that you made yesterday will help to, or how much do you think they'll help local authorities to get through this difficult period?
Convener, I think that's addressed to me, is it? So perhaps if I answer it in two parts, if I could talk about pay and then I could talk about the funding package. So in terms of pay, of course, hugely grateful for the heroic efforts of all key workers across Scotland, and many of them are in local government. And whilst I value and fully recognise the contribution that they make, of course, pay for local government employees will be negotiated between the unions and COSLA. We're not part of that process. I meet regularly with the unions, but they accept, I accept, and I'm sure the committee accepts that the Scottish Government's not part of that process. In terms of the funding, the local government settlement provides an increase in day-to-day funding for revenue services of £335.6 million. There's a small difference which I would invite the committee to consider between recurring funding that's baked in, as it were, part and parcel of the settlement, and there is separate funding which is specifically for COVID pressures. So in the earlier session, Sarah Boyd asked me about loss of income, for example, and COVID pressures. And we have already provided £200 million plus £49 million as part of our efforts to deal with loss of income and COVID pressures. And yesterday I announced an additional £275 million for this current year to deal with COVID pressures. So that should deal with COVID pressures and put local authorities in a more in a stronger position going into next year's budget. Next year's budget also has a further £259 million, again, that is not ring-fenced, so they can use it for the pressures that they identify and can see, but it is non-recurring funding, and that reflects the way in which we get funding, which is that all the additional funding of this year is non-recurring. So we can't assume that next year the additional £9 billion will carry forward, and therefore the plans we make for that funding has got to reflect that it could just be one-off, and that is then passed on to local government. So that's a long-winded way of saying there is an increase in day-to-day funding as part of the settlement of about £335.6 million. Alongside that, there is non-recurring funding to deal with COVID pressures, and obviously it's for local government to give a response to that. But from my reading of the pressures that local government is facing, it is very much a fair budget, both in terms of the increase to core revenue as well as the substantial additional funds to deal with COVID pressures.
Okay, thank you for that. Both Cabinet Secretaries will agree that local authority services are absolutely central to helping Scotland achieve its healthy and active national outcome. COSLA therefore complained that there had been a real terms cut to the Scottish Government revenue allocation to local authorities since 2013-14, whilst Health Board allocations have risen by over 15%. Do you think this demonstrates a preventive approach to spending? And if you agree there's an issue there, how would you see it being resolved?
Well, again, I think that's probably a question for me. This goes back to the commitment that the Scottish Government has made and which we're often held to account for by other parties, which is a commitment to pass on all health consequential funding from the UK Government. And that has provided a degree of protection to the health budget. Now, alongside that, and despite that, we've continued to provide local government with fair settlement. I'm not saying that coming through a decade of austerity has not been hard, but to pass on that consequential funding to health has required us to take very challenging decisions elsewhere. And through that time, we have prioritised and protected local government budgets. So during the period of this Parliament, from 2016, local government has enjoyed a cash increase in their overall budget settlements of over £1.3 billion. And the pre-COVID-19 last year's settlement of £11.4 billion provided an increase in local government day-to-day spending for local revenue services of £589.4 million, or 5.8%. That increase in day-to-day funding is carried forward into next year with a 3.1% increase. So, I don't in any way underestimate the challenges that the public sector in Scotland has faced under a decade of austerity. But it should be noted that Scotland's local authorities have seen a cash terms revenue budget increase of 3.6% over the period, despite that decade of UK government austerity, and English local authorities have faced a cash terms revenue budget reduction of 14.7% over the same period, which is equivalent to a real terms reduction of 22.8%. So it's been challenging within an ever decreasing budget over the last decade. We have sought to protect local government alongside passing on the health consequentials.
Thank you very much for that. I was just about to bring in the Cabinet Secretary for Local Government here. Can I ask around the preventive approach to spending? Do you think that the IJBs are sort of like the first step that hopefully the government will be able to make more steps towards that preventive approach?
Yeah, actually, I was trying to interject before I thought you might have moved on, but it was more on that point around the joint working. I guess that's the questions that you've posed there presume that it's either there's local government and health then doesn't work together, and IJBs would point to a place where there is collaboration. The other place that would point to in a policy sense would be Public Health Scotland. Again, those are that body is jointly sponsored by the government and by COSLA to enable us to think about how do we improve the health of the nation very much in that preventative mode. The other thing I would point to, and this is purely, I think, off the top of my head, and Kate may be able to kind of correct me if I'm wrong, but there is a significant investment to active travel within the budget as well, to enable us to think about how we increase activity, which again helps improve health and well-being. I think that was just, around £100 million as well. So I guess my plea to the committee is to not just to see health and well-being and activity levels primarily through the lens of one single portfolio, very much look across the whole piece of work that Kate presented to the Parliament a few weeks ago, and also recognise that we are endeavouring to embed some of the really good partnership working that we saw over the last 10 months to recognise the benefits of partnership, of acting preventatively, and to make sure that we can support that. And I think, through IJBs, through Public Health Scotland, there are mechanisms and structures there now to enable that to have a bit more momentum behind it.
Thank you very much for that. I'll now bring in Sarah Boyack.
Thanks very much, Convener. I really want to follow up that point about the Cabinet Secretary for Finance mentioned the decade of austerity, and one of the impacts on that was the huge pressures she's already referred to. Can I get you to focus on the issue of unprotected budgets, because we get pressure from local government telling us that the core services are not funded sufficiently, but unprotected budgets, issues that are going to be critical going forward, such as economic development, employability services, issues like leisure and culture, where you've seen huge pressures in the last year. If we want to move to COVID recovery, how do those services get funded when actually they've seen a decade of cuts and underfunding, and local government is struggling to provide investment into core services?
Thanks for that. I'll tell you the way I don't think we should do it, and then the way that we should do it, because I know I'm often pressed on making sure that as much of the budget is de-ring fenced as possible, and that's something that I wholeheartedly support, because I think that decisions about council budgets are largely for councils to make. Now, in terms of the ring fencing next year, it will only amount to £925 million, or less than 8%, and that's largely due to pupil equity funding and the expansion of early learning and childcare. So I do strongly believe that our approach needs to be to allow local authorities the financial freedom to operate independently and to manage their own budgets and to allocate the total financial resources available to them on the basis of local needs. And the last point I'd make before I actually answer the question is that, again, in the earlier session talking about financial flexibility, so what's come through loud and clear this year is that local authorities have used that independence and that freedom to build their budgets in very, very different ways. So whether it's the difference in the dependency on income replacement, whether it's the different makeups in terms of ALIOs, there is a wide variety of structures and setups for local authorities. And I think that demonstrates that they are using their freedom, they are operating independently to manage their own budgets and to allocate the total financial resources available to them on the basis of local needs. In terms of the specifics of your question, though, in order to ensure that we deal with the current crisis, and it's important, I think, for us to help local government as much as we can to deal with the COVID pressures, so that those COVID pressures are not eating into core settlements. So, in terms of how we recover from this quickly and efficiently, that's why we've been so concerned about loss of income. Because if we can help to cushion local government against that loss of income so that there's no detriment to their core services, it means that they can continue to take those decisions going forward. And we need to work with them to maximise all the available resources and allocate additional funding and reprioritise existing funding to ensure that they are cushioned against the COVID pressures. And I think it's very difficult to cushion anybody against COVID pressures right now, such as the magnitude of the impact. And then building on that, dealing with loss of income, then building on that, it's to ensure that each year they do have a settlement that deals with pressures. And this year there's been a big focus on all the additional funding that's come to the Scottish Government of over £9 billion. But I repeat that is not recurring funding. So that funding cannot be used, for example, for pay settlements. It can't be used for ongoing, perhaps, tax commitments. It's got to be used for COVID pressure. And alongside that, the Scottish Government's core budget has not increased to the tune of £9 billion. So we have got to work with local government to ensure that there is sufficient funding for their day-to-day funding. And that's where I go back to the figure of a 3.1% increase compared with last year's settlement, £335.6 million, to deal with last year's settlement.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The question I asked was about non-core funding and was about how local government addresses issues like employability, economic development. Those are important issues, not just coming out of the pandemic, but I would argue they were important beforehand. But those are the kind of services that you've seen staff reductions, you've seen services cut because it's non-core. and yet that's where our inequalities issues are arising. And the previous question from the convener talked about health and social care partnerships and integrated joint boards, and feedback from councils about care funding is that they haven't had the care funding, and that's where all the pressures are that's led to calls for national service standards for care. So the first half of your answer didn't really answer my question about how do we use, how do local government get the support to build out of the pandemic? And you didn't really answer that question. There's more money for town centre investment. How much of that will go to local government, and how can they actually have the staff to make the most of those investments if they've had to cut back over the last decade?
Well, in terms of other policy areas on employability, a lot of that goes through local government. And in terms of funding for social care, a lot of that goes through local government. It may not be captured in core settlements in terms of employability, but a lot of it goes through local government. And I agree that that's where inequalities are tackled. But the vast majority of that, if you take my statement yesterday, whether it was funding for welfare, whether it was funding for housing, whether it was funding for employability, whether it was funding for town centres, the vast majority of that funding goes through local government. You won't see it in these figures, but most of it goes through local government.
Yeah, sorry, my point was that the staff to actually deliver on those services have been cut over the last few years. And you just reminded me yesterday, I asked you about council tax, the funding of the freeze for council tax for next year. Many colleagues are very concerned that by only funding 1 year, you leave them with potentially having to double council tax next year if you haven't provided that core funding for council tax freeze going forward. Will you commit to that?
Well, I've said already, and I'm not going to change that I don't work on future years' budgets whilst we're in the throes of next year's budget. But clearly, I've heard the concerns that have been raised, and when we come to next year's budget, we will take that on board, not least because it's only a matter of months before the local government elections.
Thank you, convener. And can I get a brief comment from the Cabinet Secretary for Communities about the issue of inequalities and the capacity of local authorities to respond, given that the preventative health approach often means that they have to put extra resource into IGBs and health and social care partnerships to fund core care services?
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and I think I would refer back to some of the points that Kate made there as well about the money and the resource that has been provided for those key areas that need attention to help tackle inequalities. That is rooted largely through local authorities. We do work in partnership with local authorities and in terms of employability. In my own portfolio, that is a key area for us to help tackle poverty. That's why we work with local authorities on our Tackling Child Poverty plan to ensure that support for instance, parents who have particular needs in terms of support to get access to employment are supported, and that is done in partnership with local authorities. So we do, and we continue to work with them on these key areas because they're shared areas. They're the shared aspirations to create the fairer Scotland that we all want, regardless of whether we're a councillor or a MSP, and regardless of political party. We work jointly to deliver them. Now, if there are issues of capacity, then of course we'll work again with them to address those issues, and that's why we worked with local authorities on the Social Renewal Advisory Board. They were a key partner there to try and work out what are the things that we need to do so that we don't revert back to the normal that had failed so many people in the past. Instead, what are the actions, the key actions that we need to do together jointly, the changes that we need to make, regardless of how uncomfortable that might be for either party, to try and ensure that we have capacity, that we have support in place in the right areas with the right and appropriate support. So that is why we want to act preventatively. We endeavour to act preventatively. We support local governments through funding and through that joint work. And the Social Renewal Advisory Board points to the way forward to help enable us to deliver on that. And that's the key. That's the key test of that. The Social Renewal Advisory Board set out calls to actions to help deliver on that issue that you raised around tackling inequality. And what we now need to do is to make that happen in practice. And that will require us to work together, not just between local government and national government, but the health service, wider public life, and also the third sector. And that's what the commitment within the Social Renewal Advisory Board set out, and that's why we need to respond effectively to it as well. But that might require us to rethink things and to rejig things, and that requires then a level of maturity in the political debate as well about that, because some of those things will be difficult, possibly, and that means we need to work collectively across the next Parliament. That'll be a challenge for all MSPs who come back next year, to work through how across the Parliament people can focus on the right things to do and help support those right things to do to go forward. And again, we work in partnership with local government to do that, and have provided funding, substantial funding, to enable that to happen.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sarah. Alexander?
Thank you, Convener. If I can ask the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, with reference to the funding that we have in Scotland, Cabinet Secretary, there has been some criticism about the way in which the Scottish Government has managed the funding process, because you've identified a number of small pots of different funding. I think there were 30 in all, and local councils have had to deal with additional administration, reporting, monitoring, and ensuring that that funding is progressed. And as I said, there was some discussion about what happened in the United Kingdom when larger tranches of money have been available. But you made a specific decision to ensure that it was a smaller pots that were used. Can I ask why that was the case and the implications that that has caused?
Thank you. This actually refers back to my answer yesterday in the budget statement to one of Alexander Stewart's colleagues, Murdo Fraser, because over the last year, the funding that has been made available to the Scottish Government has come in tranches. And with each tranche, we are told that that is all the funding available to the end of the financial year. So we've got to budget within that pot, and we work with local government to determine how much of that we can give to local government. And we go through all the motions of that, only to then a few months later receive another tranche of money from the UK government. And our commitment is to pass on as much to local government as possible. But it does make it very bitty. I talked about dribs and drabs yesterday, and I don't think the Scottish Tories like that very much. But it's true that when funding is coming to us in tranches, it means that passing that on to business, passing that on to local government, passing that on to the health service, it's all done in pots of funding when we believe that that's the only money available to us until the end of the financial year. So I think it is a far from ideal situation. But due to the fast pace of change as well facing all of us, it has been necessary to allocate a number of additional funding pots as priorities have changed, as the pandemic has unfolded. But I would agree with the member that that is not the ideal way to do it. And I would refer him to my choice yesterday to distribute a much bigger tranche of £275 million allocated, which is not ring-fenced. It's been allocated in a full tranche of money for local government to determine how to spend. And again, next year, I've started next year's budget with an additional £259 million. That has now been agreed with COSLA. They will have complete autonomy to allocate their agreed share based on local needs and priorities. And that's certainly where I want to get to, which is giving much bigger tranches of money that have no conditions attached for local government to use as it sees fit.
And the money that is being distributed is there to support, assist individual organisations to ensure that they can thrive and survive. But there is no doubt that, as we already have seen, and many of us receive daily responses back from these organisations and individuals saying that it is very difficult for them to manoeuvre through some of the restrictions that take place to try and make sure that they fit the criteria of some of those funds that have been put in place. And many people fall between a rock and a hard place when it comes to that. And we have a real difficulty of ensuring that the right funding is getting to the right people at the right time to ensure that they can support and facilitate their business or their organisation to, as I say, thrive and survive. And that has been and continues to be, Cabinet Secretary, a problem for many individuals and organisations.
And I'm assuming you're talking there about business support. The thing is that if we didn't take a sectoral approach, so if there was just a blanket approach, which incidentally is what happened south of the border, a blanket approach, the Strategic Framework Business Fund is the only blanket approach. It'd be very simple and straightforward to operate, but a lot of businesses would fall through the cracks. Now, these businesses differ hugely. So today, or yesterday rather, we launched, for example, this is just one of the 30 sectoral schemes, the mobile close contact services. So for driving instructors, for beauticians. Now, they don't have premises. They don't look like a big manufacturing company. And therefore, the only way we will reach them is by having bespoke schemes. Now, this government is committed to trying extremely hard with the powers that we have and the funding we have, not to leave anybody behind, not to exclude people, not to stick our heads in the sand, as the Chancellor would, when it comes to those who are not getting funding. But it does mean it's a far more complex picture of smaller schemes to try and help people. I think it's worth the effort, worth the funding to try and help those that have been excluded and left behind. But I'm not going to pretend that it isn't complex and it isn't confusing. And local government have done a tremendous job of trying to get these schemes open. They've done that in January, 30 new schemes since Christmas in trying to help those that have been left behind, all the way from outdoor tour operators to the marine sector to the newly self-employed. They've all been left behind because they weren't captured either by the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme or by furlough. We have tried to help them, but it does make it complex.
And I would agree that, I think local government have done a tremendous job in trying to manage the situation and support individuals and organisations. If I can have my final question to the Cabinet Secretary and Local Government. In your opening statement, you talked about the social enterprise projects and the funding that was going into that. Now, this is another sector that is struggling to make sure that they are obtaining the funding that they need. Many of them are hanging on by their fingernails as to where and when that will take place. And once again, Cabinet Secretary, many of them who thought they might fit into some criteria have found that they do not, and they've had to go and resource funding from other sources to ensure that they can continue.
Thank you. Yeah, and we have, and I've certainly had conversations with Kate and colleagues across the government to make sure that it's understood that social enterprises contribute to most portfolios across the government. It's important, therefore, that we recognise the specific needs, and we have endeavoured. We had very early on in the pandemic, we had a support put in place to help social enterprises, the wider third sector, to help them cope with the impact of the pandemic, and have ensured and worked to make sure that the further and subsequent funding streams that have come online further through the calendar year were there and could support social enterprises. Moreover, we have made sure that the infrastructure around social enterprise has been supported so that they can direct and give really good advice to our social enterprises across the country as well. And of course, going forward, we'll continue to look to see what more we can do to protect and support third sector and social enterprises as a result of COVID in the next financial year. But like I say, we have put in place finances. We were the first ones working with social enterprises in Scotland to develop a fund and support scheme early on in the pandemic. The funding streams that came online after were able to be flexible to help support social enterprises And if there is a requirement to do more, then we'll work with them to enable that to happen. And the support for the infrastructure around the social enterprises is important, because that can provide also the good in-kind support as well as the right guidance as well.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Gordon McGovern.
Thanks very much, Convener. And my initial questions to the Cabinet Secretary for Finance. Edinburgh, there is a lack of housing, and it's a major issue. And we've seen the population in Edinburgh rise by 13% over the last 10 years. And while the number of completions last year for affordable homes was excellent at 1,300, looking at the budget for 21-22, we're seeing a cut in the housing budget despite your additional funds announced yesterday. And I'm just wondering if you could give us some background, given the pressures in Edinburgh, at how you arrived at the decision to cut the housing budget.
Thanks. So I've been clear at Finance Committee, and I can be clear here today that housing is a priority. The spending review in November from the UK government is the main source of information for our own budget. So it may well be that the UK government revises some of those figures at its own budget, but we're going on the best available evidence, which is the spending review. And the spending review substantially cut our capital, so it cut capital by 5%. The vast majority of that cut was due to cuts in financial transactions. Financial transactions were cut by about 67%. And it's financial transactions that's really powered a lot of our building work and our work more generally on affordable homes. So with the financial transactions budget decimated essentially, we have tried to use it for our two top priorities. And our two top priorities are the Scottish National Investment Bank and affordable homes. So we have not met the full request for affordable homes, but we have used as much of those financial transactions as possible alongside capital to meet the commitment on affordable homes. I've said in the past that if more funding is made available in the form of capital or financial transactions, then housing would be my top priority to fund. Now, we received some additional funding, and you can see the truth of what I promised, which is that with that additional capital funding, we prioritised affordable homes, which is why there was an increase of £120 million in capital yesterday. Now, if that figure is again revised on the 3rd of March with the UK government's budget, I will revisit the housing budget. But for now, we have used all the resources that we can to protect the affordable housing budget, not just because of the importance it is to Gordon MacDonald's constituents, but also because it's a really important way of revitalising the economy.
Thanks. And can I move on to Aileen Campbell?
Sorry, would it be okay if I
could
add in just that housing sits in my portfolio as well? And of course, we are really grateful because we've had such a thorough engagement with Kate and her team on the importance of housing, and there is a recognition across the whole of government of the impact and reach of housing beyond my portfolio. Kate mentioned the impact that it has, the positive impact that housing and housing investment has on the economy. Previous questions in this session have asked about what we're doing around creating healthy and active communities. Again, I would argue and point to housing again as being a contributor towards that agenda. It enables people to have an enhanced sense of well-being. It's a place for working, it's a place for children to be doing home learning if it's safe and it's warm, and it's important therefore that we continue to invest. And that's why in my opening remarks, the welcome announcement of further resource from Kate yesterday enables us to point out now that the 5-year housing budget is now over 3.5 billion. So that is an important signal of the importance of housing, affordable housing in particular, of this government. It enables us to achieve many of the ambitions set out in our national performance framework. And I would also point out that we're currently working on our policy document, Housing to 2040, because of the huge importance that we attach to housing, to set out a longer term strategy around housing as well over 20 years, to provide the certainty, the clarity that the sector have told us that they requirement, but also to signal the long term commitment that we have to housing because of the wide policy impact and reach that it has. And And again, that this is also important to recognise, though, that we have done that despite the cuts that Kate pointed out to financial transactions and uncertainty around the consequentials. So we've endeavoured to work really hard to protect housing because of its importance to the well-being of Scotland. And the other thing was around is around population shifts as well. That's another key area that we need to think through as well, about how we support communities that are seeing population decline, along with the point that Gordon MacDonald made around particular population pressures in the east of the country. And again, Housing at 2040 would also look to tackle some of that, or at least point towards how we might tackle that going forward.
The other aspect of housing, of course, is the existing housing stock. And the budget document states we will also act on the recommendations of the Parliamentary Working Group for Tenement Maintenance to help owners work together to invest in their buildings, keep them in good condition and make them safer and greener. So, Cabinet Secretary, can you provide more detail on how the recommendations of that working group will be taken forward in the next financial year?
Mm-hmm. And again, I would point to the Housing 2040 document, because there has been a recognition that in terms of delivery of housing, affordable housing, it can't always just be about new build. It has to be about the ensuring that there's improvement of existing stock, alongside what will become very apparent, the fact that we will have town centres with the ability to house more people if we do and use money creatively to enable people to live in town centres. We've got that commitment around 20-minute neighbourhoods, town centre living. The points that you recognise around tenemental properties as well, we will endeavour to capture that within the Housing to 2040 framework and strategy and approach, which we'll be publishing shortly, to enable us to have the, like I said earlier, point towards the clarity and certainty that the sector needs to do the things that are so necessary, and to not just solely focus on the delivery of new build, because there is such an important that we need to recognise around supporting the improvement of existing stock, not because it's the right thing to do, but also because we have really stretching demands placed on us around zero carbon and energy efficiency targets as well. And we just need to recognise that tenemental properties do pose some challenges there, which is why that will take care and require careful handling.
Okay, and my final question is back to Kate Forbes. We talked last week about councils' usable reserves, and the Audit Scotland report suggests that the usable reserves for local authorities is between £2 and £2.5 billion, which has grown substantially in recent years. And I'm just wondering, has any analysis taken place of the level of reserves that councils are using to keep services going, and do you take them into account when deciding the local government budget allocation?
Well, on the second part of your question, no, because my expectation is that local authorities use their resources as efficiently as possible and deliver services effectively to ensure that all of us as taxpayers and our communities get the best possible value. And decisions on the level and the use of reserves are rightly for individual councils. It's their responsibility to take decisions that are prudent and sustainable. And how that is done is a matter for individual local authorities, who are responsible for managing their day-to-day business and are ultimately answerable to their electorate. So the levels of reserves reflect prior year decisions taken by each local authority on its spending plan, and it's not taken into consideration when deciding local government budget allocations.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. Andy Whiteman.
Thanks very much, Convener. Could I first just follow up a quick question for Aileen Campbell? You mentioned that the Housing 2040 strategy will be published shortly. Can you confirm whether that will be before dissolution, or are you planning?
Yeah, it's my intention to publish before dissolution.
Okay, that's very helpful.
I accept, acknowledge that we'd hoped to have been able to publish something earlier, but I'm sure everyone can appreciate that the particular challenges that the housing officials have experienced because of the pandemic, and to try and ensure that we have the right supports in place on housing policy, that's taken priority, but we're working to ensure that we can publish the document before dissolution.
Okay, thanks very much. A question for Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Kate Forbes. You mentioned in your opening remarks that you regard local government as I think you said, a close partner. Now, obviously, each budget is each budget, but it fits into a pattern. So between 2013-14 and now, the revenue for Scottish Government has increased by 3.1%, and the revenue for local government has decreased by 2.4%. The gap between the two has been growing. Is that intentional? Are you concerned about that? And do you intend to do something about it?
Well, I would refer Andy Whiteman back to the answer I gave to Sarah Boyack, which is that if we are committed, and I'm assuming that not all parties will agree with this, but some will, if we're committed to passing on all the health consequentials to health, a big driver of our budget has been health consequentials. So once you pass on health consequentials to health, then it means that the Scottish Government has not seen that increase that you reference. And despite that, we have protected local government budgets out of the remainder once you pass on that health consequentials to health. It has been a decade of austerity. I don't think anybody would dispute that. We look at Scottish Government protecting local authorities' budget alongside what's happened elsewhere in the country, where English local authorities have seen a budget reduction of 14.7% over the same period, which is equivalent to a real terms reduction of 22.8%. So in straight up maths, we have sought to protect local government budget with the budget that we have whilst passing on health consequentials. That's the straightforward answer to the question.
Okay, thank you. My next question is for Aileen Campbell, and then maybe Kate Forbes could come in as well. Cabinet Secretary, following on from that answer in relationship to passing on consequentials for health, that this June it'll be 10 years since the Christie Commission published its landmark report, which contained important recommendations about preventative spending. Now, I understand obviously that in a pandemic the health budget needs protected, but what progress is the government making specifically in this budget to advance the notion of preventative spending, which has got a potentially big implications for how much we spend on health?
Okay, thank you. And I think that question is really useful, and it touches on some of the other themes that have emerged through the course of this morning session. I would point in my own budget, in my own portfolio, to the housing. I think we've tried and sought to change the narrative on housing from it being simply seen to being something around bricks and mortar to actually having much wider impact and reach. So, for instance, I also have policy responsibility around child poverty. Now, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation pointed to the specific and very tangible benefit our child poverty endeavour feels and experiences as a result of our investment in housing, that we can see child poverty decline because of the investment in good social and secure housing. So that's one area. We're investing heavily in housing because we recognise that it has an impact on child poverty levels. It's an impact, though, also on our public health and wellbeing. If it's safe and secure and warm, it enhances wellbeing. People are far more likely to want to go and contribute, and people become active and healthy. And I've seen that many examples in the course of my time in this post of what happens, the positive things that happen, the benefit that we get if we have good housing with good engagement, with good tenant participation, and how that impacts positively on people's well-being. We've also continued to support the work on supporting community partnerships, planning partnerships. We have also taken forward work on the local governance review to ensure that there is partnership working. But I would also point out as well that fairly recently that we published the report of the Social Renewal Advisory Board, which set out 20 calls to actions and recognised itself that there had been progress made since the Christie publication. It recognised that in itself, that their report was 10 years after Christie, pointed to further work that we need to do using the change and significant shift in context that has created, that the pandemic has created, and the need for us to do more in this space around prevention, in collaboration and partnership working. Another area that I would point to that I think is going to see real benefit in the space that you've asked me about is community wealth building as well. And we've supported more directly the Ayrshire growth deal through investment in community wealth building in Ayrshire to take the work that North Ayrshire has been at the vanguard of to ensure that across the whole Ayrshire region that is an approach that benefits South and East Ayrshire. We had the commitment in the programme for government to support community wealth building in other local authority areas as well, and that again tries to shift the balance of our economy, a less extractive economic model, ensuring that we give communities much more ownership and agency over the economic development in their communities, and also looks at what we can do with those resources that we have. So trying to get in about procurement, which and making sure that again doesn't become an extractive form of investment, but actually enables the community to feel some sense of benefit from the resources that are invested. So a few areas that we can point to directly around that agenda, which I think is ensuring that we can meet the aspirations set out in our national performance framework.
Could I come in on that? If that's okay, because just 2 brief points around preventative spend. I do think that we need to get better at monitoring and demonstrating. So the examples that Aileen Campbell have used, I think, are all brilliant, and how we demonstrate the knock-on impacts and the preventative benefits of choosing to invest in areas that are not obviously health related, that have a preventative impact on the health services is really important. That monitoring is important. But the second thing, I often have really good discussions in committee about preventative spend, and whether this committee, I think in particular, has often challenged me on preventative spend. The difficulty is, as soon as we get to Parliament, if we're talking about, for example, shifting funding away from, I'm going to use the sort of extreme examples, but shifting funding away from acute services to parks, as an obvious example of where there's value in spending funding for preventative reasons, then the debate does not, as it were, work out in that way, because we are always analysed and scrutinised and held accountable for funding consistently increasing in every line. And I think Parliament needs to have a careful debate, and we all need to, as it were, get a bit more mature in our discussions about preventative spend, because we have to be willing to free up funding in some areas and shift it to other areas if we truly believe in preventative spend. And I don't think the political debate certainly is anywhere near that. And if we want to move to a more careful analysis and scrutiny on preventative spend, then we have to be willing to do that.
And Kavira, exactly as the theme of the Social Renewal Advisory Board's report, it's about recognising that we can't be in a space where it's just more piled on more without there having to be some kind of recognition that if you want to see some change, that has to come from somewhere. But the space isn't always there to have that open, candid discussion. And and I guess, hopefully for the next Parliament, for those that serve in it, that will be something that can be opened up.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andy. Keith Brown.
Hey, thanks, Convener. Can I have a couple of questions to the Cabinet Secretary for Communities and Local Government, and then 2 to the Cabinet Secretary for Finance? And the first one to the Cabinet Secretary for Communities and Local Government. As she just made clear, she will shortly be released from the pressures of the job that she currently does, and I wonder if I could possibly tempt her to think about more generally about the housing budget, by which I mean, if you take all the different aspects to it, housing benefit, the huge monies that we spend on temporary accommodation, very expensive. I'm thinking of all the revenue. I think it's probably between £3 and £5 billion a year, including housing benefit we spend on housing. Does she think that is something that we could more usefully look at in the round? For example, we churn money around the system for rent payments, which never really touch the people that are paying rents. I just wonder if she thinks there's perhaps a better way to organise it, specifically to achieve the things that she said, which is to alleviate child poverty and provide that warm, dry, safe, appropriate home for everybody.
Yeah, and we'll be setting some of that thinking out in the Housing to 2040 document, and through the consultation phase of that, we had posed those questions. Setting out, here's the kind of total that's spent on housing in its broadest sense. Now, if you had that on a blank piece of paper and you had that money to spend, is what we currently have what you would do with that money? And that kind of, I suppose, set in people's minds that there may be other and better ways to use that funding to ensure that you had the maximum impact. Now, some of the levers and the tools are not in our gift. So we have to do what we can with what we have, and the Housing to 2040 document, because it's taken that longer term strategic approach, will enable some of those discussions and those kind of ideas and those policy approaches to develop, and those changes to start to happen. But you're right. I mean, some of the really frustrating things, and certainly my portfolio, is around discretionary housing payments, where a lot of that money is spent on mitigating in full the bedroom tax. Now, do we want to be using resource in that way to mitigate against something that's somewhere, a government that has taken action that we disagreed with? I think not. But what we want to do then with the Housing to 2040 document then is to try and work out how can we take a whole systems approach to improve the way in which we deliver housing, to make sure that people get the housing that they deserve in the places that they want to live. And I think you're right. I think that there is probably better ways that we could spend it. Unfortunately, at this point in time, we don't have all the levers available to us. But what we do have is the opportunity to use what we do have better to deliver more for the people and communities of the country.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for the answer, and also congratulate her on getting the additional money from the Cabinet Secretary for Finance towards affordable housing. But just on that, it's a very specific point that concerns me. Are the affordable housing targets and aims of the government not undermined when local authorities who can oblige developers to include a certain proportion of new housing development as affordable housing simply opt instead for a cash payment or something else in lieu of the absolutely vital affordable housing, which you can get developments which I'm well aware of, which are exclusively £500,000 houses, which don't help the situation at all and don't create mixed communities. Is she worried about that? And is there anything that can be done about that?
Well, certainly the what we want to do and achieve through the Housing to 2040 approach is to, and one of the themes, without giving too much away, is around how do we start to enable there to be much more mixed communities, that we use that opportunity to ensure that it's not just that communities are vibrant and thriving, and that requires us to not just have communities that are segmented in the way that you describe. But what I would also say, though, is and point out that we wouldn't be where we are with the level of housing that we have and can point to over the time that we've been in government, had it not been for the cooperation of local government. The local government have played a full and active role in helping to ensure that we can point to significant improvements in the housing stock across the country, and that is because they've played a full and constructive and positive role in it. And we'll continue to work with local government to see what more we can do to eke out extra support, finances, whatever it takes to ensure that going forward we can also build and create the communities that we want people to live in. And that the Housing 2040 approach will set some of that out. But I wouldn't want to detract from the good and full and positive role that local government has played in the current housing stock that we've created over the time that we've been in government.
Thanks for that. And for the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, I wonder if it's possible just to zoom out a little bit since we're on a Zoom call. I suppose we're all trying to work out whether what local government is getting is fair, and obviously this committee is very concerned about that. And on the one hand, is it fair vis-a-vis other things which the government is funding? And you've pointed out how we passed on health consequentials. Personally, I think some of the nonsense you get from opposition parties is debunked when you realise they haven't put any amendments up to the budgets, I think in the 14 years that I've been in the Parliament that I can remember. So that would tend to assume there's a fair degree of consensus about how the budget is distributed around the Scottish Government's responsibilities. But the other side is compared with, say, local government in England. Now, we had evidence last week from COSLA where they compared Scottish funding unfavourably with England. And I've just heard you say, Cabinet Secretary of Finance, that we have plus 3% plus increase in government funding for local government in Scotland, whereas down south it's gone down by 14.7%. That really struck me as odd that COSLA could draw a comparison which was unfavourable, albeit in relation to COVID funding. And it seems very much in the other direction. We hear about English councils going bust on a regular basis. I just wonder if you could say a bit more about that, because COSLA seemed unable to answer that question about the comparison between funding for local government in Scotland and in England.
Well, I think it was last year that I was answering questions at this committee, and COSLA had been previously on and had said that unlike English local authorities, which had been decimated, and I think that's a synonym rather than a direct quote, local government in Scotland had not been. So I think COSLA must be referencing this year's funding in terms of the 2020-21 and cannot be referencing any years prior to that, because the figures speak for themselves. You know, I think Andy Whiteman quoted the years 2013 to 2020. I think that's related to a SPICE report. In that period, English local authorities have faced a cash terms revenue budget reduction of 14.7%. That's equivalent to a real terms reduction of 22.8%. And in that same year, those same years, or sorry, in terms of this Parliament, local government has seen a cash increase to their overall budget settlements of over £1.3 billion. So I would absolutely refute any notion that English local authorities have been treated more favourably in that period of time. Under a decade of austerity, they have been treated anything but favourably in England, whilst here we have tried to use our budget as far as possible to protect local government budgets. But when you look at this period in particular, the approach we've taken to next year's budget is that there's three primary sources of funding. There is the primary source of funding going on core settlements. That sees a 3.1% increase. But over and above that, there's two other sources of funding. There is replacement of lost income, and that is now, as I've said already, that was the 200 million plus 49 million plus 275 million to help deal with the lack of income. And then the third section is de-ring-fenced funding for local government to use as it sees fit next year to deal with COVID pressures. That's £259 million. So I don't think you can look at all of that funding. Now, I've separated it out to indicate to you the sources of the funding, but collectively, it's all money, it's all funding, it's all cash. And I don't think that you can look at that package of funding and not conclude that we have in this year's budget delivered a fair settlement to local government. I'm not disputing. In my job, everybody can tell me that they want more money for a whole host of different things. So I'm not disputing that there won't be additional funding for a whole host of different things. But in terms of the overall package for local government for next year, is a fair settlement. And I'm assuming that after the 3rd of March, when we have more information about our own budget, it's not unthinkable that I won't be returning to the Parliament to update Parliament on budget changes again, because we've built this budget on partial information.
Yeah, and that leads in nicely to my last question. Can I make one more question, Convener?
Well, very briefly, and the response will need to be very brief as well.
Just very briefly on that last point, you mentioned dribs and drabs, Cabinet Secretary, and you might have to come back and change it again. Is it not the case now with these additional tranches being announced, and also local government asking for more certainty in 3-year budgets, that the whole system really is in danger of just becoming discredited. We've moved so far away from the devolution ideal of having some certainty around budgets. But surely the fiscal framework, the announcement of dribs and drabs and new tranches just make the whole system untenable in its current form.
Absolutely. And it's not just the Scottish Government complaining, as it were. It does a disservice to taxpayers. It does a disservice to local government. It does a disservice to households who rely on that funding and who need certainty. So we're going to be in a position where our budget is confirmed on the 3rd of March, a mere week before local government has got to set its council tax. So even if you ignore Scottish Government's concerns, you see that waiting until the UK government's budget in order to set our budget would be impossible for local government. And that's why we go ahead, but we can only go ahead on the basis of partial information. And that's why I will keep going back to Parliament to make updates. Not because I didn't know how I wanted to spend the money in the first place, I did. But I can't, because I can only spend what I'm given, because I can't overspend my budget. And so I think absolutely the fiscal framework has been found wanting from in the pandemic.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, Jeremy Balfour.
And good morning, Cabinet Secretaries. I've got 2 questions for Kate Forbes and 1 quick one for Eileen Campbell, if that's okay. My first one to Kate Forbes. Cabinet Secretary, you've obviously given this money to local government to freeze council tax for this financial year. Looking ahead, and I know you don't like doing budgets ahead, but what conversations will you have with COSLA in regard to keeping the differential the same so there doesn't have to be a massive hike in council tax in the next financial year?
Well, briefly, I will have extensive conversations with COSLA in advance of any budget. I have a number of conversations. I meet regularly with Gail McGregor. I have a very constructive and productive relationship with her, and we will replicate that next year, subject to the election and whoever's in my post.
But from a kind of planning ahead for local authorities and also for people within Scotland making their own personal financial decisions, when would you see that decision being brought forward? Would it be towards the end of this calendar year, or would there be an indication earlier than that?
It would be part of next year's budget. On no other tax, I don't think, am I being pressed right now. You're not pressing me to determine what income tax rates will be in next year's budget, whilst we still haven't passed this year's budget. And I don't think anybody expects me to set next year's council tax before we've got through this year's council tax.
Okay, thank you. The second question is around, we've talked a lot about revenue this morning. There had been no increase in the capital budgets for local authorities. And again, just to get your thinking around, particularly as we come out of this particular crisis, and we need perhaps to look at capital budgets, look at capital builds. Again, why no increase for local authorities around that?
Well, when you adjust it for one-off funding provided in this financial year, i.e. 2021, support to local government for capital investment through the settlement has increased by about £10 million for investment in flood defences. And other support for capital investment to local government out with the settlement has also increased by £44.5 million. So the overall increase in support to local government for capital is £54.5 million. And capital is an area which is really challenging for us at the moment. It's an area that I have a strong suspicion the UK government will revisit on the 3rd of March, because they have said that they want to build and invest in infrastructure, but the figures did not back that up in the spending review. So they may well revisit that. And if they revisit their capital, then I will revisit the capital.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. My final question is for Eileen Campbell. You touched on this in one of your answers earlier on this morning. But the issue for Gordon MacDonald and myself within the areas that we represent is that we have growing councils, and yet the amount of money that's coming to some of these growing councils is not as much, and councils which are seeing a decrease in population are perhaps getting proportionately more. I just wonder what conversations are Scottish Government having with COSLA in regard to rectifying that going forward in the next number of years.
Does that question largely around the kind of distribution formula, in which case that is something that is kept under constant review and is agreed with COSLA on behalf of local authorities. And I think from what you described, in terms of from our perspective, we're always open to suggestions of improving the formula, but they must come through COSLA in the first instance. So if COSLA and councils want to engage with us around how there may need to, do we need to look at how councils' budgets are reflected in terms of their population, then that's something that would have to come via COSLA, if I'm interpreting your question correctly. In terms of some of the questions I think that Gordon MacDonald raised, we're certainly looking at population challenges in terms of the context of Housing 2040. But I know also, though, that my colleague Fiona Hislop is more directly in charge and responsible for issues around population and the challenges that we face as a country in the whole. She's responsible for policy there and is continually developing that about how we respond to some of those challenges, because equally there are other local authorities that you pointed to that are facing decline in population, an older population more generally, a challenge for the country as well.
But would you recognise, I accept that COSLA has to come, but from the Scottish Government, would you recognise that the formula at present does discriminate against councils which are growing with a growing population, such as Mid Lothian, Edinburgh and East Lothian?
So like I say, this is something that's kept under constant review between COSLA and the Scottish Government, and it's agreed by COSLA on behalf of all local authorities. So again, I would point out, if there is an unhappiness around that, then that needs to be articulated by local authorities and through COSLA in order for the Scottish Government then to try and look and work with COSLA and local authorities to respond to whatever challenges are presented to us. But that's the dynamic in that agreement and arrangement.
Convener, could I come in quickly on that? Just to emphasise 2 points. One is that the distribution formula uses the most up-to-date population estimate, so I think that's important. And also, when it comes to formulas, I think that every local authority, and I don't dismiss this, but every local authority can tell me why they feel uniquely discriminated against as per the funding formula. So just to Aileen Campbell's point, that if we were to revise it, which there's an openness to do, it would need to come from COSLA.
Okay, thank you, Convener. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That completes our questions, and can I thank both Cabinet Secretaries and their officials for attending today's evidence session and providing much needed additional information in advance of debates on the budget bill. You can leave in the usual manner by pressing the red telephone icon, and I remind committee members that they remain in public for the next item. I will now suspend for 5 minutes to allow a witness changeover. Thanks to both of you again.
Thank you.
At agenda item 5, the committee is taking evidence from COSLA on local government's perspective on climate change and the green recovery. I welcome Councillor Stephen Heddle, Environment and Economy spokesperson, and Silke Isbrand, Policy Manager COSLA, Aubrey Fawcett, Chief Executive Inverhip Clyde Council, and Paula McClay, Policy and Insight Senior Manager, the City of Edinburgh Council. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you for your written submission. For information, we've allocated just over an hour for this session. Some brief technical information. There is pre-arranged questioning order, and I will call each member in turn to ask their questions for up to 9 minutes. It would help broadcasting if members could indicate who in the panel their questions are addressed to. We may have a short amount of time for supplementary questions at the end. As there are 4 panellists, please indicate clearly if you wish to answer the question, for instance by raising your hand, and don't feel the need to answer every question fully if your views are generally in line with points already made. I suggest we make it our working assumption that questions are directed in the first instance to Councillor Heddle, and he can pass them to others if he wishes. And could everyone please give broadcasting staff a second to operate your microphones before you speak? I now invite Councillor Stephen Heddle to make a short opening statement.
Thank you very much, Convener. Yes, I'd like to first thank the committee on behalf of COSLA and my colleagues for the opportunity to give evidence today on the Scottish Climate Change Plan update. Climate change is a global emergency which will need a cross-government planned response over many decades. And COSLA is committed to rising to this challenge with an overarching objective across all our policy areas of a just transition to net zero by no later than 2045. There's no real precedent to what we're seeking to achieve in the next 20 to 30 years in terms of the decarbonisation of society and the economy, although the pandemic response perhaps gives us a glimpse of what is needed and indeed what is possible in terms of coordinated effort. The just transition to a net zero economy society will take all our collective effort and ingenuity to achieve. It will require unprecedented cooperation between different parts of the public sector, private sector, communities and all Scottish civic society. Part of why we're glad to be here today is that we honestly cannot see a pathway to achieving our net zero goals fairly, which does not include a central role for local government, and indeed this was recognised in the Paris Agreement. We believe that this role must extend beyond being just a delivery partner for national programmes, must build upon the strengths and capabilities of local government, which have been exemplified during the COVID-19 pandemic response. And this role must also build upon the best examples of joint working between local government and its partners, most notably, of course, the Scottish Government. In short, I believe that local government needs to be trusted to govern wisely and to lead the carbon reduction response locally within the framework of the plan. This will require a positive decision to invest in local authorities in addition to national programmes if we're to make the biggest impact, with genuine coordination of local and national contributions achieved through genuine partnership. We fully support the ambition shown by the Climate Change Plan update, and while many of the targets will be hugely stretching, we must be led by science and not just settle for what seems achievable now. We're also of the view that while refining the Climate Change Plan update is important, we must now be focused on delivery and making these important investment decisions which can take carbon out of our economy as quickly and as fairly as possible. If there's barriers to achieving the targets, then we need to talk about them honestly and to identify what can be done to alleviate the constraints. Finally, we recognise that the Climate Change Plan update is a lengthy and detailed document, and we're still learning about its implications for local authorities. I understand, therefore, that there may be some questions which we cannot fully answer today, and if that is the case, I'm happy to commit to provide more detailed responses on the specific points if required. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Heddle. We'll now go on to questions, and I'll kick off by asking, you've just talked about the update there. Do you think it recognises the roles of councils in respects to the climate change agenda?
It's difficult to summarise that in a few words. I mean, it's obviously a 255-page document, and it makes copious reference to the public sector, of which local authorities are part. I would say that it absolutely recognises the role of the public sector, but we feel that it could develop more the role of local authorities in moving forward, being the major employer that we are, and running the vehicle fleets in the states that we do. So I guess the main thrust of our evidence today is to convey the absolute belief that we can achieve more in terms of tackling climate change and achieving net zero in the timescale, or ideally ahead of the timescales that's set out in the climate change plan, by working more closely with the Scottish Government in developing the detailed responses. That's obviously the next step, as well as just being a delivery agency for it. So it's a yes and no answer, but the main thing that we're trying to convey here is that we're absolutely up for tackling the existential challenge of climate change, and approaching the climate change plan update effectively with open arms, saying, come and work with us. We're happy to do our share in tackling this problem.
Talking about doing your share, at this point in time, how well do you think councils take the need to reduce emissions into account in their spending plans? Are there improvements needed, do you reckon, in this area?
Well, I mean, local government's obviously being pulled in many directions with their spending plans. In that, my colleague Gil McGregor has given evidence to this committee and explained how we feel that we're underfunded, and that the funding that we do get is ring-fenced to an extent that we can't innovate or indeed maintain the services that we like. In terms of the spending pressures that we're facing, I mean, we feel that we could absolutely do more, certainly in tackling climate change if we had more funds. But the likelihood is we might have to do less, because we have non-statutory services such as economic development, which is active in supporting innovation and activities around climate change. And we also additionally fund areas like public transport, which obviously makes a contribution. So absolutely, local authorities are totally committed to tackling climate change. I find this reflected in the attitude of the board, which I chair for COSLA, the Environment Economy Board. The attitude of our members and the level of information of our members in dealing with the issues that we face today is very high.
Yeah. I get that you are, you're keen to be doing your bit in that, but and I also accept that there'll be difficulties sometimes in following through with reducing emissions because of other pressures in your spending plans. But are they taken into account when you're looking at your spending plans? Do you, as part of the how are we going to spend this money, is reducing emissions in that, even if at the end of the day you sometimes can't do what you need to do?
Well, I mean, the internal reporting structure of local authorities in how they deal with issues in front of them will vary across the country. I mean, I can say with absolute certainty that the local authorities are achieving very well in reducing climate change emissions, as reported statutorily. I quote the figure with a 23% reduction in 18-19, which is down from 15-16. So clearly there's an awareness and enthusiasm, and many of our members are setting targets in reducing with tackling climate change that exceed the government targets. I could quote a list of them quite happily.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm giving you a necessarily high level perspective. I'm sure my colleague Mr. Fawcett could give a more informed.
Yeah, if he wants to come in, so I will let him in now. Mr. Fawcett?
Yes, thank you, Convener. I'm on an iPad, which means I have to demute myself by the looks of it. Good to speak to you, and thank you for asking me along to give evidence. Just to answer your question on, do councils take account in their spending plans? My own authority over the past, since 2015, has reduced its carbon emissions probably by a third, and we've taken a whole range of different activities to facilitate that. We have revamped and renewed our school education estate, and we have introduced electric vehicles. We're heading towards, well, by next year we'll be at 75% of our light vehicles being converted to electricity. We have significantly reduced the level of oil in the heat of buildings, and I know a number of authorities have moved towards net zero plans, and in our own authority we've set aside £100,000 to prepare for that. There's a requirement, as you may know. We had a letter from Rosanna Cunningham to declare what dates we're going to achieve net zero by November 22. So, and I know Glasgow, for example, has set aside £1 million for preparing for that. So there is a significant amount of work has gone on over the past 5 or 6 years. An enormous amount, obviously, to do over the forthcoming decades. So that'd be my response to you, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And obviously there's a lot of good practice going on in your local authority and some others. I'm just wondering how widespread it is. Are all local authorities approaching it in the same way, or are there strengths and weaknesses across the local authorities?
Is that back to me, Convener?
Yourself or the councillor?
Okay, well, I'll start with this, and maybe Stephen wants to come in after that. Yes, as far as I'm aware, local authorities, for example, on converting to LED lighting, that's happened extensively throughout local government. And as far as I'm aware, other local authorities are being proactive in terms of dealing with the issue. I think it's critically important, not only government recognises, but local government recognises the importance of this agenda and the huge task ahead. So, in my view, I would say yes, absolutely, Convener. I don't know whether Stephen's anything to add.
Okay, Councillor Heddle.
Yeah, happy to come back on that. Obviously, I chair the Environment Economy Board, and we have the views represented by all 32 local authorities. We also have fed back into that board the views of the various professional associations around housing, planning, and indeed transport. And in sort of preparing our response to this committee, we obviously canvass them for their views. And with that in mind, I would appreciate if you could perhaps bring in Silke from COSLA to maybe summarise some of the views that's coming from that. I was mentioning the local authorities that are committing to targets in excess of the national targets. We have examples: Edinburgh, Glasgow, Highland, Dumfries and Galloway. My friends in the Colin and Neil and Sear as well are committing to this. And examples such as Renfrew have committed also £1 million in this financial year to examine the opportunities around that. So I think the answer to your question essentially is yes. But it's obviously local authorities are different sizes and have different capabilities to respond to this. My own local authority has, we're investing in having a climate change officer as well as project resource around renewable energies projects. But it's a big thing for us, but it's a small thing in the context of other local authorities. But proportionately, it could allow us to decarbonise probably about 80% of our current carbon excess in one project by going through this. So we believe this is replicated across the country. But I mean, having taken Edinburgh's name in vain, I should perhaps suggest you ask Paula as well for her more detailed response as well as some. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Silke?
Yes, thank you. Just coming in very quickly on the back of what Councillor Heddle has said. Yes, it is true that I think it is very fair to say that local authorities across the board, the 32 local authorities, are very, very engaged. And as Councillor Heddle pointed out, we had a very, very active debate at the last board with the 32 members on this issue. And there's a clear commitment. Clearly, local authorities are doing it differently in different places. Rural authorities have slightly different approaches to urban authorities because the challenges are different. Agriculture plays a different role in the Scottish borders than in the middle of the city of Edinburgh or Glasgow, where you've got urban congestion and other opportunities. But I think we can reassure the committee we're working very strongly with the 32 local authorities. I'm aware that on your deadline for responses to the climate change plan update on the 12th of January, you didn't have that many local authorities sort of like feeding back to you. I think everybody was very aware of the short deadlines, and we wrote out to all the local authorities and actually actively sought their observations on the climate change plan update. We asked them, what they would need to step up their action and so on. So yes, I think it is fair to say that that's a very, very active dialogue across the 32 local authorities, and we're engaged with them on that.
Thank you very much for that. I'll now bring in Sarah Boyack.
Yeah, I want to kick off by asking Stephen Heddle about the whole issue of community renewables and community co-ops that local authorities can set up. You mentioned in the answer to a previous question to the convener that it's something that you're looking at in your local authority. And obviously there are different opportunities in different authorities, as you just heard, from urban and rural. What's your take on it? Because there's been work done in the past. I know the Edinburgh Solar Co-ops had a big impact. It's not for profit. Aberdeen's had heat and power company since 2002. North Ayrshire is setting up a solar farm, and these are all companies that invest back into the local community. What's the capacity of local authorities to do that? We've just spent the last hour talking to cabinet secretaries about finance and coming out of COVID, but there's going to be a green recovery. Where do these kind of projects fit in, where councils use their land and buildings, but they get other people to invest in, and then you recirculate the money back to your local communities? I'm just wondering what the appetite is and the capacity to do that. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and the appetite is certainly there. The capacity, I would say, is variable. I can certainly speak from the example of my authority, where we've had a range of experience in this, in that initially, say 5-6 years ago, we supported community development trusts to put up community wind turbines and to generate a return to the community. We realise there's obviously issues in that some communities themselves have greater capacity to do this, and it can lead to inequality across our area. So our focus has shifted more towards an all-Orkney approach, whereby the local authority invests in a community wind farm, and we're exploring the possibilities of sort of wider investment by communities, by community organisations in this, as well as the return just coming straight back to the local authority. I think most local authorities would be keen to pursue this, but the financial capacity is perhaps the main obstacle. There's also the element of risk as well, because it's I should be well aware the transmission regime is discriminatory for the more rural areas, and places a huge upfront cost in being able to access the grid. So the ability to de-risk such investments would be a way to enable more local authorities to pursue this. And indeed, the kind of wider issue of being able to de-risk investment in actions to address climate change, move towards net zero across the whole gamut of local authority activities, including housing, including adaptations for changes of use from current carbon-intensive practices. Would be an enabling thing for local authorities, and would be most welcome.
So in practical terms, is it kind of kickstart funding? Is it networking? What would be the thing that would be the game changer? Because you're right, different authorities will have different geography. So we're going to be discussing stage 3 of the heat networks bill in Parliament, and that's just not going to work for everybody. But for whether it's heat or power, what do you think would be the game changer to enable all local authorities to have that leadership role, and to make sure that you do the create jobs, the green jobs, and you also make sure that nobody gets left behind?
Yeah, you highlight the two very important issues there in terms of the equalities and the green jobs. They mentioned the issue of capacity. It's the kind of financial capacity. It's also the organisational capacity and having the skills available in the local authorities to deal with this. And this is something that we're very aware of, particularly in terms of both housing and the planning, building standards, that there's going to be a requirement for fairly significant upskilling of the staff to deal with the looking at everything through the net zero prism. So my own personal take on this would be access to finance, and the ability to upskill their staff would be the main enabling things around this. But you know, I would be happy for my colleagues to augment that perspective.
Thanks.
Is there anybody who wants to come in on the back of that?
I can, convener, am I okay to come in?
Yeah.
Thanks. I'll just briefly cover one or two of the previous questions and then come to Sarah Boyd's question about capacity and what would be the game changer for us. On budget, in City of Edinburgh Council, you asked kind of the extent to which councils are taking seriously and aligning their budgets and spend to addressing the net zero challenge. In Edinburgh, we have made sure that, you know, this isn't about the additional project funding that comes to deliver change. It's about how we spend everything that we have and how we align all of our budgets, policies, strategies to the effort to net zero. That reflects the fact that addressing this challenge is not one project, one policy area. It is multidimensional across all that we do. So our city centre transformation plan, city mobility plan, the local development plan, which will, you know, fundamentally shape the development of the city over the next 10 years, our housing investment plan, capital programme, including the school building programme, all of those budgets are now being driven by the priority of delivering net zero. So what we spend in the round has to be aligned to it. Then we need to think about additional capacity to upscale and speed of what we want to achieve. We do need, and we are as a council, developing capacity to inform our decision making in a much more meaningful way through development of carbon scenario tool. I won't touch on that too much just now. But really that question about what is the game changer for us as a council? Do we have capacity to drive change to this degree? In a council such as Edinburgh, you know, the work that we're doing at the moment is, yes, supported by the council's reallocation of resource, but it's also been supported by additional European capacity, really to enable the thinking and the planning that needs to go into a complex sustainability strategy to take the city to 2030. It isn't just about a renewable approach to renewables on our buildings. It's about the deep retrofit of those buildings. It's about the heat networks within those buildings, the active travel around those buildings, the green, the development of green space, the sense of community beyond that, and sustainable communities. Being able to think about that, design that operationally, and then stitch together the funding to deliver that is a huge task that is challenging, and we do need to invest in that core capacity in councils to do that work. It's not just about project delivery and individual projects. It's about planning the whole system response to a net zero challenge. And, you know, we don't yet have sufficient capacity and skills to do that at the speed and scale required to deliver our net zero ambitions. It doesn't matter whether they're 2030 or 2045. So the other thing I would say, so there's a capacity question. The only other thing I would say is that while, Scottish Government has put lots and lots of projects and project funding in, that's really welcome. The onus is on local authorities to stitch that together. That is incredibly challenging for us to do at the same time as we're trying to innovate and drive speed of change.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, I'll give you an extra couple of minutes there because the answers have been pretty long so far. So.
Yeah, well, I think that last answer is dead helpful because it's the system-wide approach as well as doing projects. And I suppose that's the challenge, isn't it? So you've got your overall policy, but how do you get those extra projects actually up and running? I think the Edinburgh Solar COP took the best part of a decade. How do local authorities share knowledge and experience so that you can cut to the chase and you can use other people's experiences, good and bad, to actually move forward with some of these projects so we do get the change. I don't know if Stephen, you want to kick off with that, or one of the other council leaders?
The way that we share our best practices through both COSLA and its boards and the professional networks. Mr. Fawcett is a representative of one of the professional networks. I'm sure can elaborate on this.
Convener, I can just maybe pick up on Sarah's query around the whole issue of how we, I suppose, get new ideas. I'll give you an example. In Inverclyde, we had a hydro scheme which we went forward with Scottish Water. And some of the challenges about that was the level of return, for example, for Scottish Water wasn't adequate from their perspective. So Stephen mentioned earlier about de-risking projects. I think it's also helping local community groups if they want to move into these territories. I think the ability to, one, handhold and provide guidance. We have clearly a capacity issue within local government. There's no getting away from that. I can think of my many years in local government, and over the period of time, those areas which have been affected most in terms of the cuts that had to be taken were on the environmental side, and there's no getting away from that. And that's an area clearly that all local authorities will need to explore how we increase capacity. And in order to do that, obviously funding will be an issue. But I'll not reiterate the issue on funding. I think Stephen's covered that quite well. But in terms of helping local community groups, I think it's critical that we are at the forefront of engaging with them, trying to stimulate some ideas. We do, in the various networks, discuss good practice. And it's also important, and working with civil servant colleagues, understanding what's happening elsewhere, both nationally in the UK and across the board globally, because we obviously need to learn from these things. So there is certainly an issue in terms of capacity, ability to reduce risk, and also, I have to say, working with other colleagues in the Scottish public sector network, the ability for, I suppose, the taking on risk is something that public sector should be looking at, just on the whole.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to move on. I'm moving on to Jeremy now. But before I do, can I just ask that, just a second, please, Jeremy. Can I just ask that the answers are shorter? We've got a lot to get through, and we do need to try and curtail the responses a wee bit. Jeremy.
Thank you, Convener. I'll limit my time. One quick question. I'm interested to learn, obviously we provide key services, local authorities provide key services to many individuals, disabled, older people, those with other health issues. As we roll out these programmes in the next number of years, what effect will climate change thinking have on that? And do we see services having to be redesigned in the light of that? And I suppose my concern is that in the striving for reaching these targets, which are really important, that those who are most vulnerable are affected the most. And I wonder if there's any comments around that. I'm happy to leave it to whoever wants to jump in.
Stephen Heddle, do you want to start and pass it on?
Yeah, I mean, it's another very good question, and it's one that perhaps maybe should be more to the forefront of all we're thinking. Clearly, any policy that is brought through the local authorities is run past our equalities officers and considered in the context of whether or not a equalities impact assessment is required, and if so, that will be prepared and the impact will be assessed. Beyond that, I would say there is perhaps not exceptional provision. Perhaps there should be, but I think this is a question that's there for kind of national government as well as local government.
Okay. Is there anybody else wishes to respond to that? Is it okay? Yeah.
Thank you, Convener.
And then...
Thank you, Convener. Just aware of the time, just want to add COSLA's commitment to net zero is completely, or the support of the commitment to net zero is completely in line with the just transition. So that is something we absolutely have a focus and an eye on. Thank you.
Aubrey Fawcett.
Okay, thank you, Convener. I mean, I would say that in terms of, I suppose, those communities that suffered worse out of COVID, there will be a challenge as we go forward in terms of dealing with climate change areas. I can think of issues in terms of funding for those communities. Significant issue in terms of existing properties which are going to be retrofitted and how they will be accommodated. And in some instances, is it going to be possible for some buildings to be retrofitted without individuals having to be decanted? So I can see challenges in terms of those communities, and certainly there will be need for substantial financial support for those communities. Thank you, Convener.
Okay. Thank you. Jeremy?
I suppose just very quick, I mean, I suppose what I'm thinking about is clearly we want to reduce the amount of cars on the road. That can be one of the issues around the whole climate change, the way that we do public transport. But I suppose in all of that, my concern is that as we maybe try to limit the number of car uses, those that need to use their cars because of disability or old age are caught up in this with unforeseen circumstances. And I'm just wondering, in regard to when we do this environmental and economy thinking, are we always thinking about the consequences this will have for maybe people who can't vocalise it particularly?
Councillor Heddle.
Aubrey did a useful service there in widening the discussion to inequality in general, and building on Silka's point, absolutely we're looking at this in terms of reducing inequality in the context of the just transition. And you know, we're going to return to this again and again, I guess, as we talk about issues around housing and how adaptations to housing will be funded. So in terms of, do we singularly look at this to reduce inequality? Yes, and layer on top of that, there is the consideration of the impact on the preserved characteristics under the Quality Act.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Jeremy. Keith?
Thanks, Convener. Just one for Councillor Heddle, first, if I can. You've mentioned, quite rightly, of course, the constraints which local authorities will have in terms of resources, both financial and organisational, and what they can do in terms of climate change. But I wonder if, thinking about the high point of municipalism when councils own power companies and so on as well, if you think there's any further powers that local authorities would need to help them in terms of climate change action.
It's difficult to single out a specific power. In the islands, we're in perhaps the fortunate position that through the Islands Act, the Scottish Government is committed to explore affording powers that we can identify that would help us in delivering our activities and goals as local government, and perhaps that would be usefully extended to all areas of local government. The main obstacles that we're identifying to progress at present have been the kind of obvious ones, like finance, like flexibility to deliver, develop our programmes. I mean, we can look at the specific examples, the heat networks. I mean, heat networks is an extremely laudable goal, but the local authorities have maybe a checkered past in developing heat networks to date in terms of district heating, and the ability to achieve the decarbonising of housing with the resources that's been directed towards that, perhaps more flexibly adapted to meet the different local areas, would be of benefit to us. I mean, for the first populations, district heating's not going to make a big impact, but being able to apply your resource to perhaps air source heat pumps, which is a very effective way of decarbonising your heating, moving towards electrical heating, which of course can be wholly green. This is something that's been adopted highly in the Northern Isles, but is, for whatever reason, not really been able to be supported through any of the schemes which are more aimed at ground source heat pumps, which again have a checkered past in some areas. In terms of the more powers, absolutely the flexibility around the way that we apply planning rules and housing rules would be useful to us. Whether it strays into areas of legislation, I personally am not well enough versed to elaborate on that.
Thanks for that. I wonder if your last point's an interesting one, whether you could have councils imposing further kind of constraints on developers to make sure all the housing that they build had higher levels of climate change qualities, if you like. So thanks for that. My only other question, Convener, was it may be best for Aubrey Fawcett, but happy to hear from any of the witnesses, just in relation to procurement policies that councils have. Can they say how those are helping support the net zero ambition, and particularly if they could address that in relation to Brexit and procurement policies and how they've changed since Brexit?
Fawcett.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Keith.
Morning, Aubrey.
I would say that procurement restrictions at the moment are probably more restrictive, not pre or post, just on some of the tenders that we've done in recent times. That we still have quite a challenging times in terms of going through very stretched out arrangements, and I think if procurement rules and regulations were made less restrictive, still to be open and transparent, but we didn't have the same level of restrictions, that would make it easier for us as local authorities in terms of moving faster with some of the projects, but also would allow probably local companies more opportunity to access work locally. Clearly, when we go out to the market, it's an open arrangement compared to many, many years ago where we might have had select lists, which we're not allowed to have at the moment. So I think there are probably areas which government could look at, Keith, which would probably make it easier for public bodies and particularly local authorities to move forward with the climate change agenda and the projects that come out of that. And I think that would be a useful thing. But in terms of just going back to your question to Councillor Stephen Heddle, I would say that we probably have got quite a lot of power as it stands of the community wellbeing facilities that we look at. Yes, local authorities were involved in creating power, and they ran with police and they ran with fire and so forth. So I think it'll be up to, from our perspective, we looked at the opportunity of doing hydro and we will look at it again. And we think there are opportunities. So I I think the critical thing is about, it all boils down to money, whether we like it or not, and I think you will get more innovation if there is the capability that, from a local authority perspective, that there are funds there that we can work on. Clearly engagement with the government in that regard. Now, government has provided, and you can see from the climate change update, a fair level of funding across the board in a lot of different areas. I would say whoever has to pay for this will have to pay for it, whether it's government, local government, or the man and woman on the street. That's going to be a significant burden on us all, and whether we like it or not. And it's going to be seismic, I have to say, in terms of the challenge ahead for us all. And local government, as Councillor Heddle has said, is keen to work with central government to make sure we deliver on the agenda. And we've done that in terms of COVID. And I think you heard from the two Cabinet Secretaries, particularly the Cabinet Finance Secretary, how important it was. So I would say we have a significant role. I'm sorry, Convener, for going on again. Apologies.
Thank you. Councillor Heddle, you wish to come in, I believe?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I'll try to be more terse. Keith identifies a good point around the planning, and more flexibility around the powers around planning, perhaps rather than additional powers would be useful. Because if we could embed net zero as the kind of the central principle of the planning system, that would be beneficial. If we could reframe the planning performance to focus on outcomes and quality development decisions, that they focus on addressing the climate change issue rather than slight adherence to decision times, that would be useful. And it would all contribute to the additionality that local government can bring to this. The flexibility, to me, means additionality. We can do things bigger, better, faster, and more. And that also extends around the issue of local procurement. We have a great interest in community wealth building, primarily led by our colleagues in Ayrshire, North Ayrshire, and obviously procurement is a key element of that.
Thank
you. Right,
thank you. That's me too.
Right, Andy Whiteman.
So thanks very much, Convener. A couple of the questions I wanted to ask have already been asked. So I've just got one question, and that is that the experience across Europe with municipalities and cities who are doing a lot of work on mitigating the climate crisis suggests that the more work you do with communities, with people in the places they live, the better plans and strategies you will have, and the more easy they will be to implement. So can I ask you, perhaps starting with Councillor Heddle and then looking at maybe at Edinburgh and Inverclyde, what steps you're taking to engage communities in your plans and strategies for moving to net zero?
Yes, thank you very much. It's a good point, also bringing in the kind of European dimension, and I should have perhaps said earlier that obviously COSLA we're engaged in with European networks that add value to what we're doing. Issues with areas such as the Covenant of Mayors, Eurocities, and my own participation in the CEMR as the Territorial Development Spokesperson, and hopefully the local government day that we'll be able to add to COP26, whereby we can emphasise the need for locally determined contributions to feed into nationally determined contributions. Going back to your question, absolutely, the engagement with the communities is key, and we're acutely aware of the value that we can bring in terms of place engaging with communities, in terms of facilitating the kind of wider agendas around 20-minute neighbourhoods and the community wealth building, which I mentioned earlier on. We've already seen that we're moving towards different working practices, and we're in the fortunate position that we're able to test new working practices. Perhaps this is the one good thing that's come out of the COVID pandemic. So yeah, we're working very hard to engage with communities to create hopefully the physically and digitally connected places in partnership with them. And if we're enabled financially, we'd be able to totally integrate things. We'll be able to have accessible, integrated cycling and walking, active travel measures. We'll be able to adapt the road infrastructure to suit this, to put in the fundamental infrastructure or sustain the fundamental infrastructure that creates a community in terms of, placing the local authority perhaps more granularly in the community rather than just in a central office. Electric vehicles, charging points, and the kind of skills development in the areas. So what you describe is absolutely fundamental to our thinking and absolutely fundamental to the offer that local authority can bring to the Scottish Government, to say that we have the intelligence around place that we can provide additionality to the laudable aims of the climate change plan update.
Paul McLeod. Sorry, Andy.
I'm wondering if Aubrey would like to add something from Inverclyde's perspective, and Paula, any examples from Edinburgh?
Yeah, so clearly when we look at Edinburgh's emissions, 53% come from citizens. So citizen behaviour change and the choices citizens and communities make are going to be at the heart of getting to a net zero target. So absolutely everything that we are doing is looking at how we can inform, support, build on and engage with our communities around the actions they need to take and we need to take to enable change. We also need to maintain support for some of the more radical step changes we will want to take in terms of policy and strategy for the city. And so there's no getting away from citizen engagement and collaboration on climate action being at the heart of any plan a council needs to take forward on this. In terms of delivery, the focus on 20-minute neighbourhoods really will help us to do that around place, around natural communities within the city, and about how people live and how we enable them to live more sustainably in those communities. So, that 20-minute neighbourhood delivery mechanism that City of Edinburgh has really committed to in its recent council business plan will be at the heart of our engagement strategy moving forward also.
Thank you. Does Aubrey wish to add anything from Inverclyde?
Okay, very quickly, in terms of engaging with communities, Andy, we do locality plans, and we've had a number of town centre charrettes. In terms of, I suppose, going forward with ideas, funding is critical, and I suppose you've heard that so many times, but in terms of us engaging with communities to say, look, what would you like to do? Sadly, they don't have a lot of funds, so we have to sort of lead the way in that regard. So there is, I suppose, need to ramp up in terms of further engagement as we move on the agenda, but certainly it's done through some of the existing networks that we have in place at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. And Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks, Convener. I just wanted to continue this question that Andy Whiteman brought in. I heard an awful lot of nice warm words there, and apart from Aubrey saying that you've used the charrettes process, excuse me, I never really heard how councils are engaging with local authority, with local communities. And we've got a prime example of that in Edinburgh, where Spaces for People is being rolled out across the city. And certainly my mailbag has been full of people from both sides of the argument complaining that they've had no opportunity to engage with the council to talk about the proposals. Now, I understand, I haven't declared what side of the argument I'm on Spaces for People, and I understand it's to encourage active travel, but communities are basically saying to me that in this one specific aspect and project, Spaces for People, there has been lack of engagement with local communities, and I'm sure that is similar to other councils across Scotland. So I'm keen to understand, how do you actually involve local communities in arriving at the policies in order to hit this net zero?
So I can come back on that.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. There are two strands to the type of engagement we need to do. One is about the big picture of how we deliver climate action across the piece. We are doing that in Edinburgh through, as you might imagine, surveys, focus groups with different citizens, obviously before lockdown ensued. We also have a dialogue website, Edinburgh Talks Climate, and we are working to generate social media discussion dialogue alongside that. So very multifaceted approach. We are also engaging through schools and young people. So there is significant outreach in the round around climate action and what we need to take forward. That will continue. It's not a one-hit wonder, once and done. You have to continue that over the period of the work that we do. In terms of individual policy areas, I won't go into spaces for people specifically, but at the moment it is incredibly challenging because of lockdown to make sure that our outreach and engagement is inclusive, because it is confined to digital platforms. And definitely there are things we need to do differently and improve in there. But at the same time, we do need to move with a certain degree of agility on climate action policies and change. So we need to perhaps have further discussion as a parliament and as other democratic institutions about how you engage thoroughly and collaboratively and move at speed. And there is definitely a tension in there that we need to address together.
Okay, thanks for that. Does anybody else want to come in the background of lockdown, how they're actually contacting local communities and engaging with local communities?
Convener. Okay. Well, just in terms of engaging with communities in Inverclyde, I don't have to go too far for people to be engaging with us, or indeed all the members. They are absolutely not backward, coming forward with views. In terms of formal processes, things like charrettes absolutely allow people to come along to community halls or town halls and have proper engagement. In terms of lockdown, we've done a number of things. We've had comments back and we've changed things to reflect those comments that were coming back from both residents and businesses. So I'm not sure which area you're specifically talking about, but I would be clear in my mind that local authorities, through statutory processes, through on the development plan, if you're developing your local development plan, traffic regulation orders, all of these things gives opportunities for communities to engage with us. And certainly through local ward members, you can be assured that they are actively involved in engaging with their constituents and feeding back to officers. I don't know if that helps.
Well, it's helpful to understand what's happening in other areas. I can only talk about my own patch, and I have been absolutely inundated about one of the council projects because of lack of consultation, hence the reason why I'm keen to learn what other areas are doing given the background of lockdown and the need to engage with the public and get the public support, because we can't do any of this without the public support. So my final point before I pass over back to the convener is, what are councils doing to help shift public attitudes towards climate change? Because if we don't change public's attitude to climate change, we won't hit the targets that either the councils have set or Scottish Government has set.
Councillor Heather.
Yeah, thanks. Can I just partially address the previous question as well? I think Aubrey said it very well. That if anybody asks me how do I engage with the community, I just say, come to Tesco's for a walk with me and you'll just find out how quickly the community engages with us. But I mean, the more serious answer is that they've been fortunate enough to stay in a relatively compact community. We've been using social media quite a lot just to get out what's happening in terms of, the recycling centres, in terms of the schools changes, in terms of everything that's been coming forward, and that's given us a very widespread coverage. In terms of the places for spaces for people, clearly that was emergency measures to a certain extent. So yeah, inevitably the consultation was going to be scant for the first measures. No, the permanency of these measures as we go on, clearly this is going to be where the consultation is going to have to come in. And yeah, I can see that that's a bigger issue in Edinburgh just now. I forgot what your question was. The second question was now.
Just how do you help shift public attitude to climate change so we can hit the targets that have been set both at a national and a local level?
Apologies. Yeah, well, it's a work in progress, isn't it? I mean, this is where the partnership between the local government, Scottish government, and all of civic society needs to come together. We've seen an example of how that could potentially work through the Sustainable Renewable Advisory Group that Rosanna Cunningham convened, which was a cross-party group with a wide range of representation. And the Chatham House rules means I'm not going to go into what was discussed there, but it would be fair to say that the kind of party political allegiances were parked at the door, and the singular purpose of trying to tackle the problem and recognising the importance of leadership across all areas of the civic society was recognised there. So all I'd like to say is that COSLA is absolutely up for doing our part in this, in conjunction with national government and the rest of civic society.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, Alexander.
Thank you, Convener. Many questions have been answered, but you've talked about this morning, ladies and gentlemen, about the resources that you require to ensure that you can change the plans and incorporate the policies. You've talked about engagement, you've talked about changing attitudes within the public. But what role do councils themselves have in developing the whole green economy and the green recovery that's required? Because if we are having that resource, we are having that engagement, and we are changing that attitude, the council and its officials still have a role in delivering that green recovery that we're going to need if we wish to bounce back from the pandemic, but we're also going to need if we're going to tackle climate change effectively across Scotland. I don't mind
sorry, Leigh was wanting to come in, so I think I'll let her in first. No, and then yourself, Councillor Head. Paul?
Twofold. The role of councils in delivering on the green recovery, we have to remember the level of investment councils will be making in particularly Edinburgh Council in its city. Our housing development programme, our retrofit programme, all of that is money which is stimulating a market and creating a demand. That it should be seen as an economic good as well as something that is buying our emissions target delivery. So it is about job creation, it is about local supply chains, it is about green jobs, green skills. And when we understand that it is buying multi-layers of benefit to a city, then the business case for that change is also strengthened. So I think we do have a role as both an investor in the city and in a green recovery. We also have a role in convening and supporting businesses and private sector who are behind us largely on lots of the activity we need to take forward and how we support businesses to maximise the opportunity that a green recovery presents to them, and work with partners to develop the right skills and supply chain of skills through our education and learning infrastructure. So the role of the local government in the green recovery is multidimensional, and I would see it as incredibly important. And a green recovery brings an opportunity to the city as much as a challenge to overcome.
Councillor Heddle. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It was entirely appropriate that Paula should lead there, because she made the point, first of all, about the connectedness of everything that we're doing. I mean, clearly the key areas where local authorities are active is around transport, housing, and the adaptation of heating, and the estate that we manage. These are kind of three of the key areas alongside the leadership that's associated with them. But we're obviously invested in transport and more peripheral things like electricity production, and indeed around the whole adaptation issue for even agriculture. At the board on last Friday, we heard from I think it was our counterparts, our colleagues in East Lothian, mentioning that they're suffering terrible runoff from fields, which is damaging the roads, and so the local authority has a role to play in integrating the response by taking account of adaptation measures as well. So absolutely, we think that local government has to be front and centre in developing a kind of holistic, informed across all areas, green recovery plan, and to work with the government in doing this.
And you've talked about COSLA are working together, trying to achieve some of those goals. Can I ask about what partnership working has happened between councils in different parts of Scotland, about what they've tried or what's been achieved, or how together a group of councils can achieve something bigger and better because of the economies of scale or because of the type of environment they're working in and the goals that you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, there'll be specific examples, I think, probably around waste. Waste is an example where we've been having a very productive dialogue with the Scottish Government, perhaps an exemplar of how we could take things forward. I defer to my colleague Selka to elaborate more on that.
Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you, Convener. Yes, so just to fill in on the back of Stephen, yes, we have a strong partnership working around the waste agenda, and for example, a joint steering group where we can actually sit together around the table and develop what is the best and most effective approach here, and how we can link in sort of like waste volume reduction, upping the recycling performance together with changing systems, and how that links into the wider circular economy, and also then the job growth agenda through new technologies around and so on. I think that the point perhaps though to make here in this discussion, and I think it's also pertinent to your earlier questions of sort of like, well, what powers or what changes in legislation would councils need to make a deeper contribution here. I think just to remind ourselves that we're in a journey. We all know that the targets are ambitious. We haven't got all the answers at this point in time. We even see in the climate change plan update that all of the detailed route maps behind the big targets are yet to be developed. And I think in that respect, what we do know and what we have heard back, having gone out to the local authorities and said, what is it you need at this point in time? What are the big challenges? Yes, we're hearing, that councils need to influence regulations, incentives, delivery programs. They need enabling policy. They want to be at the table very early on to influence these things. But also, we're not sitting here with a finite shopping list. This is a journey. We're in the process of developing all these things, be it, and I think the green recovery is very much part of that. Yes, we're committed to the just transition, but we are all on a journey together in terms of finding out what enabling powers or influences in legislation or resources we need to run the just transition, the green recovery, really alongside every step in carbon reduction. So just to reiterate, we believe this is a journey, and some of the requirements that local authorities have will come out in this process.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. That completes our questions. Can I thank the panel for taking time out to speak with us today? We will consider and agree a letter on the climate change update at a future meeting. That also concludes the public part of this meeting, and I will resume the meeting in private on Microsoft Teams. I propose we resume the meeting in private in 5 minutes. Please accept the clerk's meeting request private discussion, which will be sent shortly. And as usual, you can exit the meeting by clicking on the red telephone icon. And can I thank all our witnesses this morning? Thank you. Thank you.